Thank you, President Alivisatos, and thanks to you all for being here. I'm Tom Ginsberg. I'm the faculty director of the Forum on Free Inquiry and Expression, and we are here today to celebrate, and what better way to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Chicago Principles than to subject them to some vigorous questioning and in what Paul just called constant struggle, to reflect on that. So to that end, I'd like to introduce the original panel. We brought them back together again and called them up. We have Jeffrey Stone, the chair, Edward H. Levy, Distinguished Service Professor of Law. And why don't you come up, Jeff, and send the second one over. Amanda Woodward, the Dean of the Social Sciences Division in the William S. Gray Distinguished Service Professor of Psychology. Kenneth Warren, the Fairfax M. Cone Distinguished Service Professor of the Department of English and Literature. Marianne Bertrand, who is the Chris Dialanis Distinguished Service Professor of Economics. And I'm delighted to say that we also have with us our former colleague, Angela Olinto, who is now our secret agent at Columbia University, where she serves as provost, and has joined us remotely for today. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Mark Siegler, who's here with us, who was also a member of the original committee, as well as David Strauss, who could not be with us today. In terms of format, I'm going to ask questions of our panel here. If you have questions while we're talking, please email your questions to the Chicago Forum mailbox, which is on your printed programs for those of you in the room, or on the live stream banner for those who are watching on the live stream, and then we will we'll pose them to the speakers after our initial panel. So let me start with you, Jeff, as the chair. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the context, like what was going on and why was the committee brought together and how did you do the work?
Should I go up there or stay here?
Stay here.
Okay. Well, in the spring of 2014, a number of universities, many universities and colleges across the country, began having conflicts about free speech on campus, and many of them began silencing students, faculty members, and prohibiting speakers from coming to campus. And this caused considerable concern. Robert Zimmer, who was then president of the university, decided that this was a good time for our institution to come up with a more express statement of what had long been our traditional commitment to free speech and academic freedom on campus. And so he invited me, partly because he had worked with me for many years when I was provost of the university, and partly because I've spent my entire career here teaching and writing about free speech, to chair the committee. And we appointed a committee of 7 very distinguished faculty members from across the university. And over the next several months, we took on the task of trying to draft a very short set of principles, not a set of statutes or rules, but a set of principles designed to encompass the basic values and goals of the institution. If I can give a bit of historical context, it's important to understand that universities in this country have not historically been committed to what we today would call academic freedom or free speech. Throughout the 19th century, until the Darwin era, universities basically regarded themselves as institutions committed to advocating and teaching a particular set of principles and a particular set of views. That's what they were. That began to change in the Darwin era, but even then, there was a strong pressure on institutions not to go too far in that direction as they became increasingly dependent upon donors at the turn of the 20th century, who basically said, I'll give you money, but only if you do or don't do this particular thing. As President Alivisatos explained, Chicago was unique in this regard. From our very founding, we made clear that we are an institution committed to free, open discourse, debate, and discussion without any kind of censorship of ideas. And so in creating the committee, the basic idea was not to simply state that reality, but to offer a set of views about how that manifests itself in practice. And in doing so, we met as a committee regularly I offered a very first tentative draft of a statement, and all of the members of the committee then, over the course of the next several months, offered their criticisms, their comments, their suggestions. We discussed, we debated them, and so on. We also met with other members of the faculty across the university. We met with all the deans in the university. We met with the deans of students in the university. We met with groups of students in the university. We talked to individuals outside our institution, elsewhere, including both institutions and individual scholars, and ultimately came up with a very short report. And it's important to understand that the report is meant to be a set of principles, as I said, not a set of specific concrete rules. Those have to be evolved over time. But the basic principles, I'm sure you've all read the report, are fairly straightforward. But how they apply to particular factual situations depends on all sorts of judgments. And the aspiration of the principles is that, as President Alvarado explained, is for the university to make clear that we are deeply committed to this concept of free and open academic and political and social discourse. That is how we learn. That is how we explore ideas. People once thought that in World War I it was appropriate to punish students who criticized the war or the draft, or that during the Civil Rights Movement it was appropriate to punish students who favored civil rights, or during the Vietnam War to punish students who opposed or favored the Vietnam War. These principles were meant to say we don't do that. We have to open ourselves up to different viewpoints, to listen to them, and so on. So to be very brief, a central principle is that the university will not silence the expression of ideas in public discourse because those ideas are thought to be wrong-headed or problematic or offensive, whatever. That is up to all of us to think about, to debate, and discuss. At the same time, it doesn't mean there's an absolute right to say whatever you want, wherever you want, whenever you want. Time, place, and manner restrictions that are neutral with respect to the message communicated. That is, you can't use a loudspeaker, regardless of what you're saying, near a dormitory at night or near classrooms when classes are in session. It's permissible as long as it's reasonable. That's a different set of restrictions. There are also certain types of speech, like threats and harassment, narrowly defined, that can be restricted. But fundamentally, the principle is about free and open discourse, and part of the responsibility of the university is to educate ourselves, our students, our faculty, our community members, that this is who we are. This is how we learn. This is how we advance knowledge. And that it's essential that we spend time, effort, and make the point that if you come to this institution, this is what you've come to. And it's going to be problematic. It's going to be challenging. It's going to be uncomfortable. But that's who we are.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I mean, you described them as principles, and of course that, and referred to the judgment that's needed to apply them. So I'd love to turn to you, Amanda, as a dean, someone whose judgment is probably called on all the time here. How does this work in practice from your point of view?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's wonderful to be here and to be with this group of people. When I was served on the committee in 2014, I wasn't a dean. I didn't have an administrative role. I was a regular faculty member, and my appreciation of Chicago's commitment to free and open expression and vigorous debate was rooted in my experience as a scholar and a teacher. I understood how important those commitments were for the quality of my own work, the quality of my own teaching, and the way that I could educate students, both graduate students and undergraduate students. Since that time, I have advanced into an administrative role, and I have there are other, I think at the core, my responsibility is to care for the departments under my purview and make sure that they continue to be places where that kind of culture is rich. That's how I see it. In some ways, the Chicago Principles makes a dean's life easy. During my time as dean, faculty are sometimes provocative. They sometimes advance controversial ideas and do them publicly, and sometimes the world responds. During my time in the dean's office, I have had on several occasions petitions signed by thousands of people, many of them academics, calling for the punishment or even firing of somebody in my division who has expressed an idea that they don't like. And the Chicago Principles give me a very clear way to respond to that situation, which is, of course, to say that person's views are their own, and we absolutely defend their right to express them. something that sometimes comes back in that arrangement. And I think it's very helpful for people in that situation because they often feel vulnerable, and to know the institution is behind them is enormously important. It's also important that there's a limit to how much the institution can be behind them. So sometimes having done that, I'll hear back from the person, could you please just explain that I'm really right, or that they've misunderstood what I'm saying? And I have to say, no, actually, that would be your job, not mine. And so that comes to the second piece, which is institutional neutrality, right? That we defend the right of people to express and to debate, but we don't enter into those debates. I think another place that I see the challenge as dean is to keep that culture. I mean, the power of our institution, I've heard this before, is that it's not just a set of rules in writing, but it's a culture that we all live every day, that we live in the classroom, that we live in our discussions with our research groups, that we live in our decision-making in departments, debates about whom to hire and who to tenure have this quality as well. So how do we keep that culture alive? And so how do we, when universities are places that continuously welcome new people to them, that's one of the reasons they are wonderful places to work. Every year we get generations of new students and new faculty joining us. By and large, they often come from places that don't share our culture and value and commitment. And so how do we bring them into the understanding and practice of our principles? And that's not just, like, a first way this might occur is in helping someone understand that they will hear views they disagree with. I've had conversations with new faculty who come and say, this colleague of mine, you shouldn't let them say that in the faculty meeting. And I'll have to explain, no, actually, they can absolutely say that in the faculty meeting, and if you disagree, you ought to say something about it. So there's that, tolerance for disagreement. But equally important is helping new members of our community feel that they are a legitimate part of the conversation, that they have the capacity in the conversation and actually the obligation in the conversation to make their views known. And so I think that's just an essential piece of it. And maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you, thank you, yeah. Ken, I'd like to turn to you. So locally, of course, if you look at the document, it doesn't say Chicago Principles. It's the report of the Committee on Free Expression. Sometimes after Jeff, we call it the Stone Report. And it's become the Chicago Principles. I wonder, when you were writing the report and working on it, did you anticipate it would have such a national impact on the conversation?
Yeah, thanks for that, because I do want to acknowledge that when I was invited to join the committee, I accepted the appointment with the invitation with some hesitation, and it didn't stem from any doubt about the importance of freedom of expression to a vibrant intellectual community. But I wasn't immediately convinced that drafting and publishing a statement that stood apart from what struck me as what was a fairly robust everyday effort that people on this campus were already making and trying to balance, allowing for freedom of expression of a variety of views and for dissent and disagreement, especially when views were offensive, unwise, immoral, wrong-headed, that we were kind of doing that, that these everyday practices were not always neat. At times they were imperfect, and they were always subject to debate. But despite the reality that some people at times felt uncomfortable expressing their true feelings or beliefs, the University of Chicago had not become and was not a place where political views were being routinely shut down. So I wasn't convinced that codifying these values was necessary. And to some extent, the historical narrative that opens the statement we did write and that President Olivisatos referred to in his opening remarks bore out my sentiments, because the story that these opening paragraphs told was that with some notable failings and missteps historically along the way, the university had actually managed at crucial moments to act in ways that exemplified a commitment to freedom of expression without actually having recourse to such a statement. But it was really over the course of the committee's work I came around to the idea that a statement might be a good idea, and this was particularly after having heard from our staff members in student affairs who were, so to speak, on the front lines, and said that some delineation of the university's principles would help them feel they were not flying by the seat of their pants as they tried to advise and direct students as events were unfolding. But on that account, I felt, somewhat naively, and I think wrongly as it turned out, that the document was going to be primarily an inward facing document whose crucial test would be how it would help us internally to continue to improve as an intellectual community. But as I said, I was wrong on that score. No sooner than the president and the provost had accepted our report, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, launched a campaign urging other institutions to adopt the Chicago Statement. Now, this was somewhat flattering, because among the many documents that we consulted in our work were those that had been collected by FIRE, which has done laudable work in this area. So to be held up as an epitome of these values seemed really meaningful. But I have to say that the FIRE campaign also struck me at the time as somewhat wrong-headed and premature, because our goal was not merely to have a statement, but rather to see whether our everyday practices of freedom of expression would be strengthened and enriched by having one. And there was no way to know that in 2015. We had just written the damn thing, right? The good and the bad of having a statement could only be determined by subsequent events and further deliberation. And this practice of internal reflection was actually, at the time, and many of my colleagues felt this, many of whom were members of our University of Chicago's AAUP advocacy chapter, that process was unfortunately delayed, as our late President Robert Zimmer, who does deserve immense credit for having convened this committee, seemed actually, to many of us, more willing to talk about the statement to anyone and everyone other than members of the faculty. Yet we were watching as the statement was being held up as a document that colleges and universities were being, in some instances, ordered to adopt on pain of sanction from state legislatures. Indeed, the absence of such a statement among an institution's guiding documents was being treated by some as prima facie evidence that something was grievously amiss and that immediate extramural intervention was therefore demanded. And I felt that these kind of mandates were, and President Alvisalos has said as well, contrary to the spirit and the practice of what had happened at and is still happening at the University of Chicago, a practice that was largely intramural, and has had to be subject to further study, revision through other reports, and an ongoing effort to see whether or not we've gotten things right. So the championing of the statement as a good housekeeping seal of approval, right, was ripe for grandstanding and for creating pretext for politicians to justify encroaching on the academic integrity of colleges and universities. FIRE in 2019 championed and praised Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida for announcing that they had adopted the Chicago Statement, and then to its credit had to come back in 1923 to denounce what DeSantis was doing in his initiative for the Florida college system, and has actually embarked on supported a lawsuit to stop the Florida's Anti-Woke Act, and I think that's something we should all support. But I do feel, just to wrap up on this, I think we're still somewhat reeling from what I felt was the wrong footing of an aspect of the takeoff of this, a document whose virtue was being touted prior to what we value here at the University of Chicago is testing things by evidence. Mm-hmm. I think on balance, it's a good thing we have this document. I think the process by which it became a national document has been problematic, and we're still dealing with, I think, some of the ill effects of that.
Mm-hmm. It's a great time to turn to Angela, actually. So from outside the University of Chicago, how does this look, and how's it working?
Wonderful to be here. Can you hear me, Tom?
Yes.
Well, I can hear the echo. So it's a pleasure to be here. I mean, I wish I was actually physically there. It's rainy here too, so I would love to have been there instead. But you might realize that these days provosts are busier than usual, given all what's happening in coming in executive orders, and so I couldn't be there. But it's such a pleasure to celebrate this amazing decade anniversary of the Chicago Principles. For me personally, at the time I was chair of astronomy and astrophysics, and when Zimmer asked me to do this, it was such an honor and a personal moment, because I grew up in Brazil, the dictatorship, the military dictatorship. But I put a plug here for you all to watch the Oscar-nominated Brazilian film called I'm Still Here. It's a story that I know too well. And as a scientist, I'm also very much engaged in learning by debate, disagreement, and really changing what would be considered consensus assumptions, which we know led to major revolutions in physics, for example, general relativity, quantum physics. So being versed in disagreement and able to be testing our own perceptions, assumptions, prejudices is a thing that grows in our field. The fields all evolve and thrive. So it was a real pleasure to be part of this. And as probably all of us here understand, that this concept, ambition, is constantly being challenged with all kinds of threats, threats from different points of view, but the unifying threats that most individuals are ready to defend their own freedom to express themselves, but not of those who disagree with them. So the impact outside of Chicago, I think, has been amazing. I think it's, I will disagree that I think it was a positive thing. It's 112 institutions that have adopted it. When I arrived at Columbia, many of the faculty and now colleagues very much expressed respect and admiration for Chicago principles. And so the idea of reassuring us all that that is fundamental to what we do is really important. And this was such a welcome by Columbia University of our principles that I kept saying we at Chicago a lot. So now we have a game here that every time I say we at Chicago instead of they at Chicago, I have to put $5 on the table. If anybody else says Chicago does something, I get $5 back. Right now we're in a tie, which is just a way to measure the impact of Chicago. Now, clearly, Columbia is a very different institution. The history is different. We do have many similarities, like the core curriculum. And recently, I even brought Debbie Nelson to discuss with our dean of the college the evolution of the core curriculum at Chicago, another important effort that we can learn from and share. So Columbia has many schools. So does Chicago, for instance. In Chicago, I never felt we were separate schools. Here is much more a sense of the 17 schools with their own independent views and different ways of having debate. And I think the cross-school effort is one of my goals, is to try to make sure between schools people can talk to one another, because they do differ quite a bit. The cultures in each is different. And I think that just by bringing the whole university together would be quite a success. So in short, it is a huge impact. And I think the historic moment we are living in is also reminding us that it's not just a principle, but a real effort. We need to keep building with courage and humility about what it means, and developing for ourselves, but also for the next generations, the ability to listen, build better communities by listening across difference as often as we can. So it was, I'm very honored to be part of this effort. Thanks.
Thank you, Angela. When we were, I'm going to turn to you, Marianne. When we were walking in this morning, there were some student protesters who were handing out flyers that said, "Who's free speech?" and they had their issue and such. And it's a question that we often get, when you have a society that is stratified by race and gender and such, does free speech work for everyone? How do we make that happen?
Well, first, thanks. It's really a pleasure to be here. And this experience 10 years ago was one of the highlights of my time at the university, and I learned so much from all of you guys. I feel like one thing I will start by saying is that I think a lot of the remarks that the provost and the president made talked about, kind of truth-seeking as a value of the university, and there's really very little in our principle that is about truth-seeking. It's really just about kind of freedom of expression. And I often ask myself whether it is obvious that we go from freedom of expressions to getting closer to the truth, and it feels that's very much of an empirical question. that I have. And getting to kind of your question, Tom, I think that the principles ignore, I think, some of the structures that we have inside of the university. We are not a flat organization. I feel like I don't have a good sense of the views of many of my junior faculty members, and probably that's because they know that at some point in the process I will be judging them. Similarly, I teach MBA students, so maybe that not as relevant, but I don't feel like, I feel like students are also afraid about speaking up because ultimately they get grades and, they want to graduate. And that goes back to the point that you made about culture. I think the principles are kind of the North Star, but so much is about how we turn those principles in a way of like practicing, free speech to get to the truth. How do we, bring these principles in an organization that is not flat but has, very important power structures. Another thing that I want to say is that having seen the use of the First Amendment in politics, I'm not sure that it has gone hand in hand with getting closer to the truth. It has given some people way more voices than other people. And sometimes I worry that, those same dynamics apply within the university. The university relies on donors, trustees, founders, government, government money, NSF and NIH grants. That means that, some institutes get started because there's money behind them, others do not. And that changes the kind of views that are, that are inside the university. So again, that's a matter of like how, we deal with these forces and try to make the principles kind of still shine with all of that. And the final thing that I would say is, I came to this committee kind of, understanding that some people feel more worried about speaking up, feel, sometimes isolated because their views is, kind of the minority one. And, we had a lot of conversation at the time about, safe space. And I very much left the committee understanding the values, but on the other hand, how do we implement the principles so that those people that have minority views really feel comfortable expressing their views? So that's a lot of rambling around, but I love the North Star. The details is really in terms of like how we implement them in the context of a university where there are power differences, where resources help fuel more voices than others. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yeah. Your reference to sort of the weaponization of free speech brings to mind the fact that the environment's now very different. It's been 10 years. It's been an intense 10 years. A lot of things have happened in society, more inequality, social media penetration, et cetera. And I guess I'd like to ask a question of all of you as to if you could do it again. Is there anything you would change about the report? Would you do the same thing? Maybe I'll start with you, Jeff.
I do think that the world has changed and our nation has changed over the course of that decade. And I don't think, however, that would lead me to change the statement of the principles. I think it makes clear that it's even more essential now than it was then that universities and our university go out of its way to be clear to students and faculty and donors and alumni and others that this is a fundamental element of who we are as an institution, and that if you want to be a member of this community, you have to be willing to speak out and not be afraid to speak out, not be afraid to be criticized, and not be afraid to criticize others. And that's basically what this institution is about. And I do think we need to spend more time encouraging our students and our faculty to be courageous in that regard, and not to be intimidated, not to be shy. And I understand that there are more reasons now for that than there were 10 years ago, but I don't think the solution to that is to suppress speech. I think the solution to that is to encourage people to be more willing to engage in speech, to be more courageous about it. And I think that's a fundamental challenge that we now face.
Does anyone else want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, maybe I'll just follow up on that. I don't think I would change the report, which I think is a beautiful document. There was a piece in our discussion, and it shows up in the report, that I think we could have emphasized a bit more, which has to do with our obligations as an institution that teaches people, that has a pedagogical mission, and that a central piece of our teaching mission is, of course, helping students come to us understand just what Jeff was describing. And I think we could have highlighted that. It's in the report, we definitely discussed it, but I think making that a stronger piece of the message, and it is certainly part of our practice as an institution that we do that. I'm not saying that we don't, but leaning into that more, I think would help, would be helpful in meeting the concerns of people who feel maybe this free speech isn't for me, maybe, you know, the power differentials that we talk about. And I was thinking, Marianne, when you were talking about how an important part of my experience coming here as like absolutely terrified assistant professor with a lot of argumentative colleagues, was learning quickly that we could all like each other even when we disagreed with each other, and that we would actually deeply appreciate the people we disagreed with because we might learn from them. And that is a part of our culture that we just have to reinforce, right? And that can empower new assistant professors and new students to understand that they are of value when they ask hard questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're going to hear a certain consensus about not changing the document, perhaps, because we did work a lot on trying to, you know, where we had disagreements to figure out whether there was better language, and I think we came up with the best that we could under the circumstances. One thing, though, that I've reflected on is whether or not the statement could have gestured to the distinctions in some sense between freedom of inquiry, freedom of expression, and the fact that the goal of academic inquiry is not to create an environment where everything goes, but to actually come to conclusions about what's right, what's correct, what's wrong, correct based on the evidence, the best evidence available, and that not everything gets to be treated with the equal respect and equal prestige if it has not revealed itself after the process of research, inquiry, and evaluation to warrant our respect. And I think that now that aspect of what the goal of inquiry based on freedom of expression is something that we do need to stress dramatically.
Marianne?
I think Ken stole my point. I would have said exactly the same thing. Why does it matter? What's the goal? What's the objective? Probably to get closer to the truth. And I would have loved for that to be somewhere in the document exposed.
Angela, do you want to add anything?
I would add that, it is one of 3 different principles, right? I think the Calvin report plus the Chicago principles plus academic freedom make the set, right? So the comment about, this is something we need to foster is actually in the document, right? Indeed, fostering the ability of members of the university community to engage in such debate and deliberation in an effective and responsible manner is an essential part of university's educational mission. And I think that is relating to what Amanda was saying. So the muscle of actually acting on this. But I think the neutrality of the institution so that one actually has that bottoms up that President Lovasatos mentioned, plus the serious building of fields with very deep thinking and expertise that he also mentioned is another piece. So I don't think it has all 3 components in one place, but it is a very fundamental piece of that triad.
Yeah, the way I sometimes talk about this is that free speech sort of implies the absence of constraint. Of course, you're really thinking about governments coming in as the origin of the idea. But in a university context, as you've all said, that's not good enough. And I wonder if any of you have thoughts on how actual work we might do to construct environments in which people feel free to express themselves and challenge each other's ideas. What concretely? It's the mission of the forum, so I'm looking for advice.
So we've talked about this as that this is part of our culture as an institution, part of our long history as an institution. And So you shouldn't take culture for granted, but you can certainly build on it. So I see this as working sort of from the bottom up and the top down simultaneously. The forum is so important because it provides opportunities to debate at a high level what we mean, to contest what we mean, and what our mission is, and to elevate that. But equally important is the work that we do in classrooms with our students, showing them that we, how to have a constructive disagreement, showing them that we value disagreement. We like it when they raise something we hadn't thought of, right? So I think we have to work at both ends, and there's lots of parts of the university are engaged in this. The college does wonderful work with new college students around this. The Center for Teaching helps new instructors around this, and the culture of departments. So it's, I think it's sort of an all hands on deck kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any other thoughts? Ken?
I shouldn't have looked like I had a thought right now.
It's impossible for you. You just can't help it. That's what being thoughtful opens you up to.
But, well, yeah, I think the only thing I can say on this is, I do think that there is, it's increasingly important to encourage and let faculty know that the institution will support their right to teach on controversial subjects. To let, as you say, to let students know that that is integral to the, the education that we had and we're offering here, and to just make that the, the mantra of the institution. There are going to be courses that are you're going to find challenging, and perhaps you think they are objectionable, but that's the purpose of being here. And one shouldn't attempt to summon an internet mob against faculty members who are taking on the deep responsibility of exploring difficult questions.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that the most recent FIRE report about universities reported that surprised me is that a significant percentage of our students say they are afraid to speak their minds. Mm. And I think that's a real challenge. And a part of it, as you just heard, has to do, I think, with social media. That it used to be the case that you could say what you wanted, and even if some people around you were upset, it was not the end of the world. It was not a big deal. Now the price you pay, potentially, is much greater than it's ever been in the past. And figuring out how to address that question is an enormous challenge. And it's understandable that students today, or faculty members today, are more intimidated because what they say that is controversial can be put out there and future employers can see, people they might want to date in the future can see, and it can be portrayed in ways that is misleading and extremist. So I do think we have to recognize that the current world creates a much greater pressure on students, faculty, and citizens to be silent than was true before. And I don't know what the simple solution to that is, but I think we have to recognize that that's a real part of the world we live in today. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, at this point, I'd like to invite my colleague, Tony Benoot, up to bring questions from the floor, which he's been carefully tracking as you've submitted them. Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Thank you all for this super engaging and stimulating conversation. The Chicago Forum's inbox has lit up with many, many questions, and I will try, along with the help of my colleagues, to combine and synthesize some of these. So I have a few I'll pose. So there's some questions around the processes by which the principles emerged. Why a faculty committee? Why not involve students and staff? And how might you think about those questions? And maybe the flip side of that coin is applicability. Questions around, given that it's a faculty committee and a faculty-driven process, how does this guide the life of other members of the community who might not be faculty, staff in particular?
Well, I think it's fair to say that at the time that President Zimmer created the committee, we, I think, quite naturally saw this as a statement about the university for the university, and that faculty were the ones who would do that. Now, having said that, we did indeed meet with deans and students and other faculty members to get their views on these things. So it wasn't as if we were ignorant of whatever perspectives they might have. But I think having a faculty-only committee at that moment was not strange. It didn't seem to me, at least, at all problematic. But it was clear that we needed to meet with and talk to all of these other groups and get their perspectives and listen to them and to take them into account.
Anyone else?
I remember some conversation about staff because I was always confused. Maybe you want to go back to this conversation because I was confused. Does this apply to staff or not? Yeah. Oh, I remember that we had lots of conversation about staff and whether the staff of the university was also covered by these principles.
Oh, I think our assumption is the staff was covered by this in the sense that to the extent they engaged in public speech, that they were entitled to that expression. Now, again, we do draw a distinction between speech that you engage in public discourse and speech you engage in your professional capacity. So a professor who's teaching a course on the First Amendment can't just decide to teach mathematics in the class and say, oh, I have a free speech right to do that, right? And so there are those important differences, but I think that's evident in the report itself, that we're talking about public discourse. Within speech, in terms of the actual functioning of the institution, staff members who are, a staff member who edits a journal, for example, has to act within the basic definition and contours of the purposes of the journal. They can't decide to select or publish an article that is outside the bounds of the purposes of the journal. But staff is certainly protected by it insofar as they engage in public discourse.
Maybe I'll say that there are asymmetries, right? Faculty and students are the ones who are engaged in academic inquiry, and so protections on academic freedom are especially important for the work that they do. Some of us also do other kinds of work, and there are different constraints given, like I don't have, there are limits on what I can say in my role as dean, right, that I accept as part of doing this job. And there may be, and it's interesting to think about whether this should be the case, but there are certainly differences in capacity to criticize the institution. One of my favorite sort of early free speech conversations I had with a young faculty member came to me and he said he wanted to write a piece that would be critical of the university's administration, but he was afraid about whether he should do that. Mm-hmm. And I told him if he thought he should do it, he absolutely, if that was an opinion that he took seriously, he absolutely should do it, and he did. I think a staff member, there might be different constraints around that. I think we just probably have to admit that, right? Right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it could have been the case, just to add that, I mean, I had one, this would have been anomalous at the time, say it included staff members that questions about, say, the right to organize and things of that sort might have been seen as a necessary aspect of what freedom of expression ought to cover. So I do think there could have been differences had we constituted the committee differently. We talked to people, but the grounding assumptions perhaps would have been different.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we were basically thinking about the academic mission of the institution, not so much what the staff does as staff members as such. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. It's a similar spirit to this next question, just curiosity around how it was drafted and whether the final version, or to what extent it resembled kind of the initial thoughts and maybe early drafts that you had. What did that process look like?
I actually went through several hundred emails the other night from members of the committee and others, and there were lots of changes. And different people had different suggestions, and they were presented to the members of the committee, and the members of the committee discussed them, and some were adopted, some were not adopted. But it was clearly the result of a group that discussed the various possibilities, and ultimately all of us agreed upon it.
And we all benefited from Jeff being a beautiful writer.
What were some of the things that might have come up that didn't make the final cut, if I can ask, or how did that?
Good question. I wish I could say I looked at the comments and the suggestions with that in mind. Most of them were modifying language rather than substantive changes.
I don't think we disagreed ever about the substance.
Right.
but we might have had discussions about what's the best form of the document, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe one exception.
All right.
Jeff can corroborate. I do think Jeff and I had an email back and forth about the word disruption and disruptive and how that ought to be, phrased, what it entailed, what it didn't entail, and ultimately, there are, I think, a lot of things in those emails that we both agreed couldn't kind of get in there. But that was going to be a point of, a point for ongoing judgment and contention. How much? I mean, if dissent is inherently disruptive, how much disruptive is okay in the context of dissent, and how much isn't? I don't know if you recall that.
No, I do recall that. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I think relatedly, I remember, kind of naively thinking that we could come up with like a set of bullet points about the precise exceptions, so that it would be a guide and it would be very straightforward. This is okay and this is not okay. That was indeed kind of very naive. I also kind of remember at the time, and again, this was such a learning experience, feeling like we should, anonymous speech should not be okay. And I think Jeff, very much explained to me why this was a very naive position and gave a lot of counter arguments that made a lot of sense. So these are two things that I remember where there was a lot of conversations.
Can I add one thing?
Can I add something?
Angela, yeah, please.
Just want to add one word, which I'm not sure it was trivial for Jeff, respectful manner. Do you remember that discussion?
Okay.
Which side were you on, Jeff?
Disrespect.
Necessary.
Well, one point, it's obvious, but it's worth making, is when we wrote this report, it was for this institution.
Yeah.
Right? We were not even imagining that it would be adopted by other universities. That's why we have all this, the whole first half of it is about our history and about quoting various presidents and so on. So we were not even imagining this would be something that other institutions would adopt. The first university that did was Princeton, in part because one of my former students, Chris Eisgruber, was president of Princeton. And he's the one who figured out, hey, you can just lop off the first half of the report, and then it's just fine.
Yeah. I just wanted to add one brief thing, which is on this point that Ken brought up of a disruption. For those who were not in the room, we had an example, if I could call it, a respectful disruption this morning, where the students made their opinions clear, but allowed everything to go forward. So those are where judgment calls come in, and I think judgment's just an inescapable part of making those calls.
Yeah. So that maybe leads to this next question. So I'll read this one. An essential line in the 2014-2015 report is the line that reads, quote, "In addition, the university may reasonably regulate the time, place, and manner of expression to ensure that it does not disrupt the ordinary activities of the university. But these are narrow exceptions." How do you see that line of where expression should not be suppressed and when it crosses what's sometimes called the limits of free speech, another way of putting it?
Well, the key point about that, it's not about the message being communicated. That is, that deals with, as the examples I gave earlier, loudspeakers and so on, that the university can regulate the time, place, and manner of expression without regard to the message being communicated if the means of communication themselves are disruptive. Now, what does that mean in any given situation is something somebody has to decide, right? That's a somewhat ambiguous concept, but it's like the law of the First Amendment. It's a bit ambiguous, but you hope people at the university who apply that will do so in a sensible and logical manner. But the basic point of it is that it's not about distinguishing between whatever it is that people are saying. It's about simply whether the means they're using is disruptive, and no matter what they say, we treat it the same, whoever's engaging in the expression.
Like clearly this bedrock principle of viewpoint neutrality that cuts across, of course, your expertise and how you think about this, Jeff, as a First Amendment scholar. I wonder how other folks see that from their maybe disciplinary or background entry points into this conversation.
I don't know that disciplinary background comes into play. I think, it seems to me the challenge, because judgment is inevitably called for with respect to thinking about place, time, and manner restrictions is whether or not uniformity, strict uniformity, will always be the proper standard, because those on the ground may make a determination that while this thing is violating some aspects of time, place, and manner, it might be allowable for extenuating circumstances that can be produced in the moment as justifiable. And then you'll have another event down the line where the extenuation is not granted, and the question's going to become, well, why in this instance and not in that instance? And were viewpoints considered in that in making that distinction? And so I think that that's going to be a tough one all the way around. I don't think one can have absolute uniformity because everybody's going to be dealing with things in the moment. And so we have to, I think, be open to consistent review of how things were handled, and sometimes admit that this was not, it should have been done differently. Be quite open. The goal, I think, being here that, and perhaps the advantage we have as an educational institution is that, that's what we do. We try to educate, we try to figure out, we get it right, we get it wrong, we admit that we didn't get it right, and we try to do better the next time. But I don't think that as we, think about those distinctions, that we should try to hold ourselves to something like absolute uniformity. We want fairness, and we want defensible fairness, I think. But to equate those two things might be a mistake.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a theme that has come up in the conversation and was prominent in the questions that came across the digital transom as well. But clearly, the report makes no mention or indicates that the purpose of the document is to serve as a policy template, nor principles for other institutions. The reach has gone much further than our own institution, of course, and sometimes has been pursued in different ways and applied in different ways that you touched on. Is there a disconnect between the values listed in the report and other maybe prominent ways that you're seeing it pursued outside of the institution? We talked a little bit about the state mandates, but how do you see this having legs and reverberating in ways that are both maybe positive and not so positive, or?
Well, I think I've already said stuff on that, so I'd like to hear what other.
I mean, as I said at the outset, the standards in some sense are ambiguous, and they can and will be applied differently in different circumstances, both by different institutions and perhaps, unfortunately, even in the same institution, depending upon the nature of the speech and the timing and the circumstances. So, one can imagine, I'm not saying I defend it, but one can imagine the university being more tolerant of certain types of speech in terms of its disruptive capacity than other speech, because the people who are administering the rules are more sympathetic to one set of values and messages than others. That's not what it's supposed to do, but in the real world, that's inevitable, and it happens all the time in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important that this is a set of principles. But, you all might have had the same experience as me. Just after the report came out, I got emails and calls from people who wanted me to judge what was allowable, right? Is this okay? Is this okay? And I'd have to say, whoa, whoa, whoa. These are principles. This isn't right. And we were the committee that wrote the principles. We're not the committee that judges whether any particular act is okay. And so application of principle is challenging in the moment. I think a very healthy thing about our current campus climate is that people debate it. There's been a series of discussions among faculty about, well, what do these principles mean? I think that is the right way to understand our commitment. It's not a static, it's not a list of bullet points, right?
And this is true in the law as well. What constitutes a threat? I mean, the Supreme Court wrestles with this question. How do you exactly define what a threat is? Or how do you define exactly what harassment is? Those are not self-defining terms. And you need to figure out a way to give them meaning, hopefully in a way that is consistent. But the truth is they're not self-defining. And somebody has to figure out what they mean in any given situation. And we were wholly aware of that at the time.
A few questions around the current climate, the current broader political and social climate. And so, for example, this is, I'm not going to read anything, this was reviewing questions. Other universities are making definitional determinations about controversial categories like what constitutes anti-Semitism. There's an executive order called, quote, protecting the United States from foreign terrorists and other national security and public safety threats, that certainly intersects with themes of how you would regulate speech policies and values on campuses. The spirit of many of the questions was, how would some of those things play out here, in your view, if we were to stay true to the report?
You mean like there's an executive order that tells us to do some things?
That would suppress ideas that are, in the words of
Well, I would very much hope that the university
immoral,
would,
offensive, wrong-headed.
well, I would very much hope that the president's office would just say, ignore those things and say whatever you want.
Yeah.
That seems to be the spirit, no? But I understand the tension. I mean, I think we were just having this conversation on the sideline before. I mean, you know, we depend on NIH funding, we depend on NSF funding, you know. Calvin report said that there are going to be exceptions, which have to do with the self-preservation of the university, and then there's, you know, different time horizon. There's short-term self-preservation of the university, and there's a longer-term self-preservation of the university, and I'm guessing that, you know, the people there at the front are thinking about, you know, these questions. But, you know, I very much hope that, you know, kind of we are, you know, thinking about the long term.
Well, I mean, one of the things that's sort of clear, it's said very beautifully in the Calvin report, that these are the principles that make us a university. And I just has to be, right? That as an institution, we stay true to them. Yeah.
I'm reminded with this question, and the language is, like some of the mentions terrorism, national security, public safety threats, you know, fill in Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. This, I am thinking, you know, I'm looking at Jeff because I'm thinking of hate speech and some of the things you've reflected on as to the posture, the tradition, jurisprudence has taken towards hate speech, which is very similar here.
Right. No, the Supreme Court has held that there is no concept of hate speech within the meaning of the First Amendment. That is, that there is not a category of expression that can be defined as not protected by the First Amendment because it's called hate speech. And it's not that there isn't speech that's hateful. The court has basically taken the view that, first of all, hateful speech is just a part of speech. And it's a way of expressing particular points of view. And also, it's such a vague concept that when you're getting involved in deciding what constitutes hate speech or not hate speech, the risk is enormous that those applying that will be biased in all sorts of different ways, and that they will choose to punish speech they don't like and not punish speech that they're okay with. And so for that reason, the Supreme Court has basically said, and this is unanimous, every single justice, whether Republican, Democrat, or conservative, liberal, every single one of them has said hate speech is not a category of speech within the meaning of the First Amendment that can be restricted because it's called hate speech. And the reason for that is not that hate speech, whatever it is isn't, quote, bad. It's that the danger of allowing it to be suppressed enables government or university or whatever to manipulate public discourse in ways that are completely biased and distorted, and that we don't want to open the door to that.
Yeah, I mean, we did have some discussion about that
Sure.
On the committee, and I think we came. I mean, we obviously came to that conclusion. And I did remember having a conversation with a Maroon reporter asking why there wasn't any mention of and sanctioning of hate speech in the document. I think overall our attitude was, you know, the university does have a responsibility to make sure that all members of its community can participate fully in our intellectual and social community, and that would be the way to respond to that concern, rather than to try to go beyond existing definitions and produce some codification of what we thought was unacceptable speech.
May I just say something? So this is an area where the United States is rather exceptional. I study other countries' constitutions, and many other countries have hate speech carve-outs from otherwise broad free expression rights. And it's a little messier than you might think. I mean, the question of who guards the guardians, who's the ones who's making the decisions, sometimes leads to some perversities. And then just in terms of legal culture, our American attitude is because we don't trust the people making the decisions, we're not going to create a separate category. That doesn't mean, of course, that under the Chicago principles that hate speech is rampant on our campus, and that's a kind of one of the misperceptions, I think, that goes on. There's other regulations, there's Title VI and other things that come into play. So I just, to me, I think you did the right thing, certainly consistent with this country's tradition, but also it just raises that question of who's going to decide what's hateful. It's always there.
And also I think it's important for the university to encourage people to engage in respectful, thoughtful speech. And that's an important part of making free speech work in an academic institution. And that's essential for us to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a great line in the report about we all share the responsibility for cultivating a healthy civic discursive space, whatever, I'm paraphrasing. And in this, I think, Dean Woodward, you alluded to this, like the relationship between Calvin and the spirit of restraint and this question seems clear. Like, were the university to pronounce definitions around contested terms like this would take an official position, and that would have an effect on the environment and how open the discourse is.
Yeah.
This was incredibly rich. It's a wonderful moment to bring the original committee back together. Thank you all for this stimulating, reflective conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.